Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School. Today we're wrapping up our tutorial flight in the 777 by looking at how to descend, approach, and land the plane with an ILS approach, and there is a ton to cover for all of this, so let's get right into it. We left the last video just as we were leveling off at cruise, but this is a really short flight, and if I extend the range out a little bit on the ND, we can actually see the top of the descent points already coming up. But a better way to see how long we actually have is to head into the CDU and then over onto the VNAV menu. On the second page here, it tells you not only how far out the top of the descent point is, but also at what time it expects you'll reach it. So what you can do is compare that to the clock that's just on the left here to get an idea of how long you actually have. We'll start preparing for the descent now then, since we only have about 10 minutes or so, and the first thing that we've got to do is update our wind data. There's a few different ways to get at it, but the easiest for me is to just go back onto the VNAV page, and then if you head through to page 3, and then from here you can pick the forecast option and finally the forecast requests, and that'll take a couple of seconds to run while it sends off the request and gets the response. Once it's retrieved the updated data, we can load it all up, and that'll provide us with the latest wind info so it can calculate its vertical profile properly for the descent. The next thing that we need to figure out then is what to set our altitude to, because if we were to leave it as it is right now at 36,000 feet, once we go by the top of the descent point, the plane would stay level at this altitude. So if we have a look at our arrival chart, there are a few different altitude restrictions listed along the route, and to reduce your workload when you're just learning the plane, the easiest thing to do is to find the lowest altitude at the end of the procedure. In this case, we need to be crossing Eddy at 6,000 feet, so that's what we'll set for our altitude. And the nice thing about how VNAV works is that it won't descend below any of the other restrictions along the arrival until you've gone past those waypoints. It's also a good practice while you have the arrival chart up to cross-check all of the waypoints of the arrival with what you see on the legs page. Of course, if you pick the right procedure and nothing's changed since you departed, it's unlikely that there'll be a mistake, but it's never a bad idea to double check it. Our next stop's going to be the descent checklist, so we can bring that up now. And the first item on here is to check the recall, so we'll head back up to check on that. And there's nothing there now for us, so we can head back down and mark that item as done. The next item is the notes, which are generated by the plane if there's been an issue along the way and it needs you to do something or not do something during the descent. Those would appear right down at the bottom here. Again, we have nothing though for this flight, so we can just check that off as well. The last three items here are all related to prepping our approach, so I'll actually bring the tablet back over to make things easier to see. We'll head into the performance calculator now and then over onto the landing en route tab. And just like with the departure, I start by importing the airport, aircraft, and the weather information, and that'll leave us just a couple of things that we need to tweak. The first of those is the landing runway. If you recall, when we planned the flight, we set ourselves up for 28 left, so that's what we're going to pick here. And depending on what the weather is doing, you'll want to change the runway condition, but for today, dry is going to be fine because there's not a drop of rain out there. The aircraft configuration defaults to using flaps 30 with idle reverse on landing and auto brakes 3, which works fine for most situations, including the one we're in today as well, so we won't need to touch any of that either. If you ever did need to reduce that landing distance, you could add in reversers to the calculation, but the biggest difference maker is going to be with the manual brakes, which will give you the best landing distance possible. For today though, we can just leave it as is. We'll press calculate, and that gives us a landing distance of about 6,500 feet, which leaves us with a fair bit of safety margin on this long runway. So now that we've calculated that, we can set our auto brakes with the switch that's just to the right here. It needs to go to the 3 position, and then we can check that off as done as well on the checklist. Next up is the landing data. So for that, we have to head back to the init.ref page. And this shows us on the right-hand side a few different landing speeds that we can pick from based on the flap setting that we want to use. The first thing that we're actually meant to do here though is update the gross weight to what it'll be at landing so that the VREF speed is as accurate as possible. And you can calculate this by hand if you like, but the EFB's actually done the calculation for us, which is a nice little shortcut. And we'll have to plug in 480 into the field to match what it says. If you pay attention to the before and after, you'll see it doesn't really change all of that much. However, our last step that we need to do here, once we've done that, is to pick the flaps 30 configuration, since that's what we used with our calculation. So we'll click next to it to load it into the scratchpad, and then we can put it in at the empty fields just at the bottom. Before we can finalize this checklist item though, we also need to set our minimums, and right after that we have to brief the approach, so let's bring the chart up for all of that. Let's start with the minimums, which are the lowest altitude to which we can descend without being able to see the runway, at which point we'll need to decide if we continue to land or go around, and it's always shown at the bottom of the approach chart. For today, that's going to be 113 feet, so we'll head to the barrow knob to set it. And to make the wheel turn faster, what I'm actually doing here is using the mouse scroll wheel to move it in increments of 10 very quickly. And then once you get close to the number that you're trying to set it to, you can do single clicks to move it by 1 foot at a time. With that set, once we get down to our minimums, the plane will call it out for us. So it's really just going to be a cue to make us think about if we're ready to continue with our landing. As for the approach itself, there are a few things that we should check, starting with the ILS frequency of the approach. The chart's telling us it's on 109.55 with an inbound course of 284. So if we head over to the NavRad page now, under the ILS section here, it's already tuned the right frequency and course for us, so that's all good. Next, we can cross-reference the waypoints of the approach so that we know what to expect, so let's head over to the lakes page for that. We'll scroll through the waypoints until we get to our initial approach fix at Eddy. That's our first waypoint of the approach, and then from there we can compare all of our waypoints and the altitudes for Sidby, He-Man, and Duyet, and they all seem to match up, so that's all good. You should also have a review of all the other information on the chart, but this will get us going for today. So we can mark our last 2 steps of the checklist as completed. And now if I mark the full checklist as normal, that's going to bring us to the approach checklist, which we'll look at just a bit later. Alright, so we're going by our top of descent point now, and in a couple of seconds here the plane will start descending, and a few different things are going to happen all at once. First off, our VNAV mode should stay as VNAV path, meaning that the plane is following the ideal glide path that it's calculated based on the different restrictions along the arrival route. We have to keep an eye on that though during the entire descent, because it can end up either in VNAV alt or VNAV speed, and that'll require us to intervene in one way or another, and we'll see how to deal with that in just a little bit. The other thing that happened when we started to descend is the auto throttle mode switched from speed to idle, so it brought the throttles all the way back, and it can now start to descend without picking up more speed. The auto throttle mode is actually going to switch again here from idle to hold, which allows you to manually adjust the throttles during the descent to account for things like unanticipated winds without having to actually disable the auto throttle completely. There are definitely a few gotchas though when you're in hold mode, and you can easily end up in a situation where the auto throttle stops commanding the speed that you're telling it to, which happened on my first few flights. So as a beginner, I'd avoid moving the throttles until you understand the basics of what's going on first, and you should still be able to land the plane fine anyways. We can also very easily see where we are relative to the VNAV path that the plane is trying to follow in the bottom right of the navigation display. This reads exactly like the glide slope of an ILS, so the plane is in the middle, and the diamond, which moves around, represents where the ideal path is relative to the plane. So right now the diamond is right at the center, indicating that we're right on the ideal glide path. But if it were below the middle, that would mean that we're high on profile, making it more likely that the plane would switch out of VNAV path. Speaking of which, we've just been prompted that there's a message waiting for us in the CDU. So if we go look at that, it's now saying that we need more drag. The solution here is to just pull the speed brakes out, and what's actually going on is that although the plane is still pretty much on the ideal glide path like we were just looking at, it also needs to slow down to 260 knots. So if I didn't pull the speed brake like I just did, the plane would start to shallow out its descent rate so that it could slow down, but by doing that it'll get off the ideal glide path and eventually revert into another VNAV mode, which is VNAV speed. The core difference between the two VNAV modes is that VNAV path prioritizes staying on the ideal glide path, whereas when you're in VNAV speed, it doesn't care about the ideal path. It prioritizes flying the speed that's being commanded, so you can very easily end up in a situation where you're way too high in that mode. The speed brakes help us to stay in VNAV path because they can get rid of that airspeed a whole lot quicker, and that means that the plane can keep a steeper descent rate all the while slowing down throughout the descent. The other thing is that you might end up having to use the speed brake multiple times at different points during the descent, so you really have to stay on top of things. Alright, we're coming up on 18,000 feet now, so we can do a few more things. First off, in North America, this is where you'd want to switch over your altimeter from the standard reading back to the local setting, and you'll also want to make sure that you've plugged in the right value for the local setting, which you can get from the METAR on the EFB, exactly like we did for takeoff. This is actually the only item on the approach checklist as well, so we can check that off now too, and it'll leave us with just the landing checklist, which we can deal with in just a little bit. Next up, we're actually going to head over to the fix page on the CDU, and we're going to add some fix rings around the airport, which is going to help us with our situational awareness as we're coming in for the approach. The first step is to just enter the waypoint that we want to create our rings around. In this case, it's going to be the airport, so we'll type in KSFO, and we can plug that in right in the box at the top. We want to add 3 rings around the airport, and the way you enter each of them is exactly the same. You start with a slash, you follow it by the distance that you want the ring to be, and finally you just plug it in on any of the rows above. We set our rings up here to be at 6, 10, and 15 miles, and if we have a look at what the ND looks like now, you can see our 3 rings are displayed here, and as we get closer, what I'll usually do is progressively reduce the range on the ND until I'm at about 20 miles or so, and at that point you can clearly see the distance between each ring a lot more clearly. These rings are what's going to give us our cues for doing different things during the approach to prepare for landing, so they're going to come in really useful, and we'll see that in just a second. There's always a period during the descent where there's not much to do except monitor your progress, but we're coming up on the next busy phase now, which is usually near the end of the arrival. When we first started our descent, we set the MCP altitude to 6,000 feet so it matches the restriction at the end of the arrival, but we're coming up on that waypoint in a few minutes, so we'll need to bring our altitude down again so that we can keep descending once we go past it. There's a few different ways to decide what altitude to use, but as a beginner, your best bet is to put it low enough so that you can set it and forget it, and like that you can focus on everything else that needs to happen during the approach because it does get very busy. So if we pull up our approach chart for 28 left, the easiest option is to pick 1800 feet as our next altitude because that's the waypoint where we should be picking up the glide slope anyways, and then from there it'll take care of bringing us the rest of the way down. Next, we have 2 non-critical items that add a little bit of realism. We can turn our landing lights to on, and while we're up there, let's also not forget to turn the seatbelt signs back to on too. Now, as we come up on 10,000 feet, the plane's commanding a deceleration to 240 knots, and if we look at our vertical speed, it's reducing our descent rate to do it, and this is another situation where I'll usually proactively bring the speed brake out to help it slow down faster, so that it can keep our descent rate up and stay on that ideal glide path. When you're getting close to the airport like this, it's all the more important to pay attention to what the plane is doing and make sure that you don't get behind either in speed or in vertical path, because it becomes really hard to catch up the closer you get to the approach. So put all of the odds in your favor at this point and lean on that speed brake if you need to slow down. Alright, we're coming up on the first of our fixed rings at 15 miles now, so we can extend our first notch of flaps, which won't do much in terms of drag, but we'll be progressively extending them so that we're at flaps 15 by the time that we reach the 10-mile mark. The other thing that we need to do is arm the approach with the button over here, and once that's done in the FMA, we can see that both the localizer and the glide slope modes are in white to indicate that they're armed, and they'll turn green once it captures the signal for them. Hopefully you're already somewhat familiar with how an ILS approach works, but put very roughly, the localizer is what's going to make sure that you're centered down the runway centerline on final approach, and the glide slope does a similar thing but in the vertical aspect instead, and it ensures that you have a constant descent rate at a predefined angle all the way down to the runway threshold. This is where proper descent management pays off, because if you're well above the glide slope intercept altitude, it will not capture it, and you'll have to try and catch up by using vertical speed. So again, use that speed brake liberally while you're still in VNAV to slow the plane down, and if you're really struggling once you're close to the approach and you're below 270 knots, you can also extend the gear early, which will act like a giant speed brake as well. We're coming up on the 10-mile marker, so we'll want to go to flaps 15, and the localizer and the glide slope have both just captured, so the modes are now green in the FMA, which is what we want to see, and it's now centering us on the inbound course of the approach. At the same time, the speed window also opened up once the localizer was captured, so that means that it's up to us to slow the plane down to our ref speed that's all the way down at 140 knots. As you can see though, I'm still a little bit fast here, and one thing that I should have done earlier on is to open up the speed window myself by pressing at the center of the button, and then slow down well ahead of time to say around 180 knots using the speed brake, and that'll make it much easier to control your airspeed as you're starting the approach. As we come up on our 6-mile markers where we can configure for landing so the gear can come down, and we'll extend the flaps to 30 for landing, and depending on how the timing is of all this, you'll likely have the config gear horn go off, but it'll stop as soon as the gear is fully extended. In terms of the landing checklist, there's only 3 items on it, and they should all autocomplete for you if you configured the plane properly. The first of those is the speed brake. It needs to be set to the armed position so that they auto deploy on touchdown to help slow us down. The gear has to be down for obvious reasons, and you'll want to make sure you have your flaps set to whatever you calculated earlier, which in our case today is flaps 30. The 777 can of course do an auto land in a lot of situations, and you don't have to do anything special to enable it either. So long as the autopilot's enabled, you'll see either a land 3 or land 2 near the top of the PFD, and in the FMA modes you should also see rollout and flare armed in white as well. If you see it's written no auto land instead, that obviously means that you'll need to land it yourself. But to be honest, I disable the autopilot on almost every approach just because it's good practice, but it's also a ton of fun to land such a big plane. You actually have to press the autopilot disconnect button twice to turn the autopilot and warning off. However, the auto throttle is generally kept on for landing with this plane, so it's a good idea to double check your speed that you set on the MCP so that it's set right at your VREF speed. You'll want to flare just a little bit before touchdown so that your main gear touchdown first, and it probably took me a good 4 or 5 landings before I got the trick to making smooth landings with this plane. It's definitely a little bit tricky to get it right, so don't worry about it if you're all over the place. The auto brakes will slow us down once we touch down, and you can put the throttle into idle reverse if your controls support it, but otherwise we have made it to our destination, so make sure that you've liked the video on your way out and subscribe for more similar tutorials.